Do you ever paint something again and again and again and again and again and again? I do it all the time. In last week's video, I showed my process for painting these little studies, and I talked a little bit about, well, something I've been thinking a lot about lately, which is, can you plan too much for a painting? Can you overplan or overthink it? The initial goal for these little studies was to kind of narrow down my composition, but also figure out what colors I really wanted to run with in the larger study. And in the end, I chose a favorite. There were little pieces of each one that I loved, especially some of the subtle pops of color here and there. But overall, I really liked this one because it captured a little more of that green, glowing atmosphere that I see all the time here in Scotland. Because we have so much moss, there's a lot of green ambient light bouncing around. Because I'm a huge purple fan, I tend to lean a little bit more into the purples, even blues, and I sometimes neglect that green atmosphere. So that was something I really wanted to take forward into my larger study. So I painted it a couple more times. In today's video, I'm going to show you my process for painting it larger. I'm going to talk about some of the struggles that I had in going from this size to this size. I'm also going to talk you through how I kind of self-critique in order to get through some of the struggles. How do I get to the final end result that I'm actually happy with? There's a lot to cover, so let's just dive right in. Okay, the first thing I want to talk about is the challenge of going from a tiny little study to a larger painting. One of the benefits of painting small is that it requires less brushwork overall. You can use a single brushstroke to represent something in the painting. You can achieve more with your brushstrokes in less space and time. And after painting a certain size for a while, I get really used to doing certain brushstrokes for certain things. I use the same size brushes day after day. I get really familiar with how to manipulate the paint with that specific brush size. And then all of a sudden, when I move up into a larger size, I either have to do 1,000 times more brush strokes, or I have to change to a larger brush, which requires getting used to. It requires getting familiar with that particular brush and how much water it holds, how much paint it holds, how to tilt it and turn it. A lot of it comes down to muscle memory, and sometimes it feels very uncomfortable to change brush sizes or shapes. So going from a small study to a large painting, I always tell myself I can have as many tries as I want. A lot of times that initial jump up in size is purely about getting used to how much water is on my brush and how much pigment I have to mix. I very often run out of color when I'm painting larger all of a sudden, and that's just because in a small painting you don't have to mix so much. I will also switch to a bigger palette so I have more mixing space, so I encourage myself to mix more paint, because the last thing I want is a scarcity mindset while I'm painting. I want to be able to pull from a pile of color as much as I need to without running out or constantly remixing. If you're switching papers, that's even harder because the paper will absorb water or paint differently than others, and you have to get used to that as well. If I know I'm going to size up later, I will use the same paper for all the sizes. That way there's one less thing I have to get used to. But not putting all the pressure on myself to get it right the first time when I jump up in size is huge. I see this first step as a way to get all the cobwebs out and have a play and just feel out the paper and the paint and the water. Gouache especially can be so tricky to get the water consistency right. It's something that takes years of practice, and even then, when you change one little thing like a brush or a paper, it's like you have to relearn it. I think that's why it's nice to stick with one size and one paper for a while to get really familiar with it. A long time ago, I bought a big block of Arches watercolor paper, and I can just cut it down to whatever size I need. That also saves a ton of money rather than buying small blocks or sketchbooks. And knowing that I have a nice stock of paper in the cupboard to work from really helps with this mindset. Now, this is going to sound so obvious, but when you go up in size, you have more paper to fill. And even if you use a bigger brush, it's still going to be a challenge because in the small painting, I could use my 1/2 inch brush to paint a rock with 1 or 2 brush strokes. In the bigger painting, I could double that brush size, but I'll still need way more brush strokes to paint that rock. Part of the challenge I face when I go from small to large is I want to capture that similar, almost abstract, very expressive quality that I got in the small, quick study in a larger scale. Because I need way more brush strokes to paint the rock on a larger scale, I tend to over render things. I feel like I need to add way more detail because it's bigger. So two things I do to help with that is, well, obviously I use a bigger brush. That is going to help me fill in the space more, and I can still create very almost abstract marks and get really big, bold brush strokes that I love. But I also constantly step away from the painting and I view it from a distance because on a small scale, we're already seeing it at a distance in a way because it's smaller. But on a big scale, it's right in front of us. It's filling our field of view much more. You have to physically back away from the painting to see it on a small scale and see all those brush strokes kind of melt together. Whenever I step away, I notice so many things that I need to fix. It's wild. Sometimes it even requires me to go away for the rest of the day, come back the next day with fresh eyes, and I honestly recommend this for every painting session. But whenever I do that, immediately see something I can work on when I come back to it. I especially felt the struggle in this painting when it came to painting the water below the rock, so in the foreground. I want to be able to look down into the water, see the rocks below the surface where the water is flowing. I love that so much, and it's something I'm kind of obsessed with lately. But in order to do that on a bigger scale, it meant way more water, way more brush strokes. And I know I keep saying that, but instead of just splashing a bit of paint like I did on the small scale and letting it bleed and flow, which kind of created that look instantly, in the bigger scale, I had to physically place my brush wherever I wanted a rock. I needed to drop tons of water and let it bleed together. I just had to multiply everything. So it was a bit of a challenge to create that abstract feel. On one hand, it's nice to have more space to put more detail in and have a bigger area that I can play inside. So letting more colors bleed together and use bigger shapes is always a lot of fun. But I need to tiptoe that line between abstract and semi-realism in order to create the look that I want. And as a reminder, we did just reopen my web shop. My new book is now on there and the other books are restocked. This is volume 2 in my Sketching Scotland series. It took me 5 years to make this book and it is twice as big as volume 1. So it's beefy and it's got a lot of good stuff in there. I really appreciate all of the support you guys have been giving us, and it's so much fun to send these books all over the world. Okay, back to the video. Okay, we are jumping over to my iPad where I can do a little drawing. Hello. And I want to do a quick critique of this before we move into the next study. So one thing I'm looking at is how are the different areas of the painting working together? So we have the background, the midground, which this is kind of the focus, and then we have the foreground. At first glance, there's a lot going on, and that's one of the things I need to think about when going into the next scene. I want the overall feeling of this painting to feel a little more serene, not quite so wild. So I'm looking at this background area and I'm thinking that needs to be a little softer, maybe a little less contrast, especially where the light meets the dark. Less of a value range there. I like the colors that are happening here, the nice soft greens, but I don't love the emphasis of purple and blue here because it draws my eye right back to that area, and I want to keep the focus here. I like the overall shapes that I have. It kind of leads us down into here, which is good. The slight diagonal of these lines works for that. I like the subtle highlights on the rocks reflecting the ambient light, but I think I want to lean that a little bit less blue, a little bit less lavender, like these pops of color I love. Usually I would just run with that, but it's again adding to the overall blue feel of the painting, and I want to lean into the greens a little more. I really like the action that's happening here where it dives down into the splashy area and then kind of fans out at the bottom. So I definitely want to keep that. One thing I don't love is the repetition of shape here. They're almost these two rocks on the side of the waterfall. They're a little too similar. So I think I want to make sure that I either stagger them a bit more or change the shapes or maybe double up on one side. I like a lot of these squiggly rock lines, but they are just a little bit distracting. I could do with maybe a few less of those. I absolutely love the pop of orange in the water. That was one of the purposes of painting this scene, is like the light beaming down into this area and catching the light under the water there. The problem is I have a lot of beautiful stuff going on that you can just see through a bit of that, but all of my white, my splashy streaks here, it covers up the majority of that. So I definitely want less of that in the second painting. This is fun, this kind of directional squiggly line showing the motion of the water. I love that, but it's just way too much in this case. The purpose of this scene for me is sitting by a river, looking down into the water, enjoying that peaceful glimmer of light and the gentle slope of the water falling down. I need to focus on that a little bit more in the next painting. And overall, I want to make sure I lean into the greens a little bit more. Not that I want it to be this green, but just I might keep this nearby as a reminder to mix a little bit more green into my scene. I love blue and purple and orange and all of that, but again, it's just something I'm focusing on this for this specific painting. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's see how we do in the next round. This was about the halfway point, and I was starting to hesitate a little. The first part went so quick, it was all very fluid, wet into wet, but now it was time to make some important decisions. As I went into the second and even third layers, I was having to decide what I was going to focus my textural brushstrokes on. Where was I going to put a little more contrast, maybe a few more pops of color? And when it came time to add the final deeper shadows in the water, I needed to abandon that hesitation and just go with it. Sometimes it's hard to paint over the first layer or two of your painting, but it's very necessary in a lot of situations. And part of it comes down to trusting the process, having done it many times before, knowing that it's going to be okay, or worst case, we can always just start over. Getting into these final details, I'm forcing myself to slow down. I'm stepping away from the painting very frequently, taking little breaks to let my eyes rest, and assessing it every time I come back. Do I really need a brushstroke here? Do I really need a brushstroke there? And doing this really helped me not cover up the foreground like I did in the first painting. Like I said, those little brushstrokes of moving water are really fun and addictive, so it is a conscious effort to not do that so much. And the final question I ask myself is there anywhere in the painting that could use a spot of darkness, a bit more contrast? Usually the answer is yes. I think this is one thing that we can hesitate on, especially if we're covering up something else we really like. But since I knew I wanted to draw the eye down into the water, I could tell it needed a little more depth and range of value. So adding a pop of darkness there was the final step. All right, so this is it, side by side. These are the final two paintings. First one on the left, second one on the right, obviously. And I definitely think the second one is more successful in terms of like hitting my intentions. There were a few little adjustments I made. For example, you can see I made this area just a little bit shorter, a little bit smaller, ever so slightly. I moved that up. The reason for that is I wanted a bit more room to play down here. However, I didn't want to lose the lovely glimmer that I had up there. I really like that. I think I could have even moved it up just a little bit more, maybe to about here, and maybe even played with a couple more rocks just to add a little more dimension in the middle. But overall, I think this was way more successful because I didn't cover it up. And trust me, it is really hard to stop. Once you start doing these fun little squiggles, you just want to keep going. I definitely felt this was more successful. I leaned heavily into the greens up here, especially this light falling down from above is like a nice soft sage green. And I mixed green into almost everything you see here. And in the shadows, especially here, I used a little touch of brown and red to kind of complement that green. And even here, I used a warmer green rather than just diving right down into those dark blues and purples because I knew I wanted some of that down here in these shadows and I didn't want that to compete. The little sliver of black here is ever so slightly distracting. It kind of helps to draw the focus back up and then the waterfall leads you back down. I could maybe have made that a little softer. In terms of my rock here and adding a little more variety to these, I think it helped instead of repeating my shapes as much. But I think I could have added a couple more, maybe changed them a little more angular perhaps could work. But, you know, also in the rivers here, you get a lot of very like round potato rocks and love covering them with moss as you see here. And speaking of which, I added a lot more moss to my rocks because again, that's one of the reasons these forests are so green. It's bouncing all that beautiful mossy color around. The one thing I do see when I look at them side by side is I wish I had splashed a little more white here. And obviously I can go back and do that, but I really like that kind of spray that's happening there. I could have a little here or a little here. That could be really fun. So in the end, I know that there's going to be a lot of people who like this one better and some people who love this one and some people who even like some of the smaller ones from last week better. Art is so subjective. But I think for me, it always comes down to intention. And did I capture the initial spark of inspiration that drew me to the scene in the first place? Even though I love little pieces of this one, I do think this one was more successful in capturing my intention. That green glowing light that bounces all around the forest and being able to see down into this water was really important to me. Even though I can a little bit in this one, I did cover up a lot of that. And I think overall I made this one a little bit more busy, whereas this one is like a little softer, a little more serene, and kind of captures that feeling for me of being there in person. I would definitely be interested to hear your thoughts about this. Did I capture that feeling or did you like this one better and why? So if you enjoyed this kind of video with the whole critiquing thing and talking through that process, please let me know, because I'm happy to do more like this. I really enjoy doing this. It's something I love about teaching, and I also am always doing it in my own head here in my studio, and sometimes it's fun to share these thoughts.